What we're going to do over the next few weeks, we're going to do this series we're calling New Beginnings, Embracing Our Next Chapter. And the purpose of this series is pretty simple, is to begin to prepare us for what God has in store for us as we think through what kind of church do we want to be. In fact, what I want to begin as a question this weekend is this. From God's perspective, maybe you've never thought about this, from God's perspective, what makes a church great? Have you ever gone to a church and said, that's a great church? Or you've driven by a church and you thought, somebody said that's a great church. What actually makes a church great? Now, this is what's interesting. If I gave every one of you a piece of paper and a pen, and I said, make a list of the qualities that makes a church great, it would be amazing what I would get back. I would get things like you need a great location, you need a great facility, you got to have great music, you got to have a great children's program, you got to have a great youth program, you got to have a coffee shop. You got to have a food pantry. You can't even exist as a church without a fog machine. So you got to get a fog machine, right? You got to be spending a lot of money on missions. You got to be baptizing a lot of people. There's a lot of things that we would begin to list about what actually makes a church a great church. But this is what's interesting. You're going to see in this series that the things that actually make a church a great church aren't things that we can count. And that's typically how we judge church. How many people were here this weekend? How many teens came to the youth activity? What's your budget? And in fact, when I was pastoring before, people would ask me all the time when I meet pastors, this is what they'd say, what's your yearly budget? For some reason, that actually impresses people, right? But what you're going to learn is what makes a church great aren't necessarily things that you can count. They're not things that you can put on a chart or a graph. And I'm really, really interested in this series because this is important to me because as you probably know if you've been around me, I grew up in church. I mean, I can say for a fact that church has been my life. And when I say that, I want to explain something. I grew up in an era where you didn't ask whether you were going to church or not. Did anybody else ever grow up like that? I mean, you knew you were going to school on Monday. You didn't get up on Monday and say, oh, am I going to school today? We didn't ask on Saturday night, hey, are we going to go to church tomorrow? Now, this is a time in our era where the average committed Christian goes to church 3 out of 8 weekends. So that means out of 8 services, they'll hit 3 of them. Now, that's not the way I grew up. We went to church every week. Every week. We never even went on vacation if it required missing church. We just never missed church. And so I did a little math this week, and I found out I have been alive 3,541 Sundays. Okay? Next week it'll be 3,542 if I make it. So I have been alive. So if you think, what is 95% of that? That means that I've been to church in my lifetime on Sundays 3,360 times. I guarantee you I've been to at least 95% Sundays I have been in church. But then I thought, wait a minute, that's just Sundays. We're not even talking about services. Because the church I grew up in, you went to Sunday morning church, and then you went to Sunday night church, and then you went to Wednesday night church. So you were going to 3 services a week. And then when I was pastoring at Hope for about 12 years, I went to 4 to 5 services every weekend, depending on how many churches and how many campuses I was speaking at. So forget Sundays. I have spent my life in church. I think I was baptized in the choir loft. Born in the nursery. I mean, I think that's where I spent my life. And so it's just been my life. But here's the thing. To be honest, the idea of just going to church, to go to church has never been that appealing to me. In fact, when I was a young kid looking at the pastor on Sundays, I used to think, that's the worst job in the world. I am never going to do that job. That dude has got to be here every week, just like me, right? So I'm not going to do that when I grow up. And so my point is, I'm not that interested in just going to church, but I'm incredibly interested in being a part of something that God is doing. In fact, if I'm going to go to a church, I don't really care if it's a big church. I don't care if it's a large church. That is totally irrelevant to me. I just want to make sure that it's a church that is in alignment with God, so that God feels like he is free to show up and do not what we want to do, but what he wants to do. In other words, I want to be a part of the real thing. I'm not interested in just another church service, another program, another activity. I'm not interested in just another project or anything like that. I am interested. I want to experience what God intended the body of Christ to be. And you know what? I think that's what you want. There's no other reason you would be here. I mean, we're in a bar with a karaoke machine that someone let us borrow, okay? So we could even have church. So you must be interested in something. So what is it that God wants us to be? I think you want to be a part of something where we're leaving some kind of legacy, we're leaving some kind of mark, we're making some kind of impact in a positive way on our world. But I want to let you know something up front. What I'm going to be talking about over the next few weeks, it has a lot more to do with you than it does me. Because it's interesting, if you study the New Testament, and if you look for the criteria of what makes a church great, it doesn't say anything about great sermons. But it talks a lot about what you do and what we do together. And so what it comes down to is basically this: are we going to be willing to do together as a family, to do corporately what God wants us to do to become the kind of church that God wants us to be? Now, I think that's what we're interested in. Now, this week, we're going to start the series off, and we're going to look at a really, really cool story from the book of Ezra. But to really appreciate Ezra, you got to understand the background of the circumstances of Ezra. And some of you will recognize this because we just finished up this series in Daniel, and a lot of the history is leading into what we're going to be talking about this weekend. So let me give you a quick Hebrew history class, okay? God came to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 and said, from you is going to come a great nation that's going to bless the world. And basically he was saying to Abraham, through you is going to become a nation of people, the Messiah is going to come. Now we know that that was the nation of Israel, right? And so Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. One of those sons was who? Joseph. Good. One person went to Sunday school, Joseph. And we know the story of Joseph, how his brothers sold him into slavery, and he ended up in Egypt through a series of miraculous events. He became the prime minister of Egypt. At the same time, there was a famine back in the land where Joseph's family still lived. So they went looking for grain. It was a great family reunion. They found out that Joseph was still alive. It was awesome. He moved the family to Egypt with them, a great time of celebration. But then over time, that family, think about this, that family that relocated in Egypt, that was the nation of Israel. And over time they grew. They were very prolific people. So much so that it says there was a new Pharaoh in the land, and he was threatened by the number of Hebrew people that were actually living in Egypt. So he thought the best thing to do, I'll make them slaves. So he made the Hebrew people into slaves. And there they were slaves for 430 years until God finally raised up Moses to be a deliverer. They crossed the Red Sea. They began an 11-day journey on foot. That's all it was, an 11-day journey by foot to the Promised Land. That's all. And they got right to the Jordan River, right to Kadesh Barnea. All they had to do was cross over into the Promised Land. But what did they do? They sent the 12 spies in. And 10 of the spies came back and said, I ain't going in there. It looks mean. We're afraid. And they decided not to go in. And God said, good, I'll let you wander around the desert for 40 years and think about it. So they wandered around for 40 years. A whole generation died off. They came back 40 years later to the exact same place, the Jordan River, Kadesh Barnea. This time they went into the Promised Land, but God had warned them, when you go in, you got to clean the place out. You got to get rid of all the inhabitants, or they are going to mess you up. And they didn't obey God. And before you knew it, they were marrying the Canaanite women because they were good-looking women, right? And they had, they had Canaanite idols on their mantle in the fire. And they were like Jews gone wild. They did everything wrong. In fact, it says in the book of End of Judges, everybody was doing what was right in their own eyes. By the way, does that sound like any culture you might live in today, right? So this is what it says in 2 Chronicles 36, verse 15. The Lord, the God of their ancestors, sent word to them, this is to the Hebrew people, through his messengers again and again, because he had pity on his people. That basically means that God looked at his people, and out of just simply a heart of compassion, he continued to be patient with them. He continued to extend mercy to them. He continued to encourage them. You got to straighten up. You got to get your act together. You got to obey my words. You've got to follow me. They refused. They would not listen. So it says in verse 16 of 2 Chronicles 36, they mocked God's messengers, despised his words, scoffed at his prophets until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and there was no remedy. That's just a biblical way of God saying, that's it. Enough. I've extended enough grace. I've extended enough mercy. You've crossed the line. You have got some hard lessons to learn. I am going to put you in time out for 70 years. Now remember, it wasn't to punish them. It was to discipline them. It was to correct them. It was to adjust them. But he says, you're going to go into captivity for 70 years. So in 586 BC, we learned this in our last series, 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 17. It says, he brought against them the king of the Babylonians, that's Nebuchadnezzar, we learned about him, who killed their young men with the sword in the sanctuary, did not spare young men nor young women, the elderly or the infirm. I mean, he wiped the city out. And you know what? I get up early in the morning. I was sitting there the other morning and I was studying and I read that, and this is what I thought. I thought, you know what? If God doesn't discipline the United States of America for the way that we've turned our back on him and the way we ignore his principles, you know what he's going to have to do? He's going to have to apologize to the nation of Israel. Because think about it. Not only do we tolerate unrighteousness in our culture, we embrace unrighteousness. And not only do we embrace unrighteousness, we celebrate unrighteousness. And we think that we're so much smarter than God, we got this stuff all figured out. It reminds me of what God said in Romans chapter 1, verse 22. Paul wrote and says, thinking themselves wise, they became fools. Every time I watch the news, I'm thinking, we think we are so wise, and God is just shaking his head and thinking, fools. We are in a battle, people. And I would encourage you, I just saw a statistic this week. 400,000 people of faith just in Wake County did not even register to vote in the last presidential election. 400,000 people of faith just in Wake County. Now, why is that important? If you truly are a Christian, I want you to understand, this is not Democrats versus Republicans. This is not conservatives versus liberals. We are in a spiritual battle. This is God versus unrighteousness. And I will tell you this, no minister anywhere in the country or the world should tell you who to vote for. But I can tell you how to vote. And if you are a Christian, you need to be looking at not parties, not platforms, not even personalities. You need to be looking at biblical principles as you make those decisions. And I'm not even talking about, I tell you what, where this is even more important, it's more on our local level. It's the commissioners, it's the school boards, it's those kinds of areas. Some of you ought to be getting involved in those areas. I'm glad we got people like Jacques who said, I don't know why anybody would want to be a mayor, because that's got to be worse than being a pastor. I mean, good gracious, you know? Can you imagine the complaints in the culture we live in today? But this is a time where, as Christians, we need to rise up and be salt and be light. But here's the thing. They didn't in the culture of Israel. They continued to ignore God. They probably just assumed, oh, it'll get better on its own. And God says, that's enough. And he took them into captivity. I'm telling you, if we don't get our act together as a nation, there is going to be a day of reckoning. You can see the handwriting on the wall. But it doesn't stop there. It says, he, Nebuchadnezzar, carried to Babylon all the articles from the temple of God, both large and small, and the treasures of the Lord's temple, and the treasures of the king and his officials. They set fire to God's temple. They broke down the wall of Jerusalem. They burned all the palaces. They destroyed everything of value there. So think about this. This great temple that David planned and that eventually Solomon built is destroyed. Jerusalem is reduced to basically a pile of ashes. Many of the residents of Jerusalem were executed. Those who weren't executed were taken as slaves into a foreign land. And this is what is known in Hebrew history as the period of Babylonian captivity. And these people, they remained in Babylonian captivity for 70 years, but in the back of their mind, there was this hope that one day it was going to end. It's not going to last forever because of something, we saw it last week, the prophet Jeremiah wrote, Jeremiah 29, verse 10. This is what the Lord says, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. In other words, I'm going to bring you back to Jerusalem. So basically, God was saying this, after you've been captive in Babylon for 70 years, after you have learned your lesson, I'm going to set you free. And just as your forefathers exited Egypt and made their way to the promised land, you're going to exit Babylon and you're going to make that 900-mile trek back to the promised land. And sure enough, after 70 years, Babylon falls to Persia. The history gets a little bit complicated based on your faces. The last series I did, a little bit boring, but once again, the Bible is proven to be right. Once again, the Bible's proven to be accurate because when Babylon fell, think about this, Persia, right away, to Persia, right away there's this king, we saw him last week, Cyrus, and he looks with favor on the Jews. He's like, I like these people. For no logical reason, he's like, I'm going to do something for them. And he decides, I'm going to let them go back to their homeland. And so he sets them free under the leadership of a guy named Zerubbabel. Okay, let's all say Zerubbabel together. Zerubbabel. So you can't say Zerubbabel without smiling. So if you're having a bad day, just say Zerubbabel, right? I will give $1,000 and I'll find it. I'll work at Raise Forever. I will find $1,000 and give it to you if you'll name a kid Zerubbabel. Okay, I do that right now. But they went back under Zerubbabel, and then Cyrus basically tells Zerubbabel this: when you get back to Jerusalem, I want you to rebuild the temple to your God. That's what Cyrus said to Zerubbabel. Now I want you to think this through. This is a pagan, unbelieving king. Not only is he sending the people back to Jerusalem, he wants them to rebuild a temple for a God that he doesn't even believe in. And on top of that, Cyrus decides, not only do I want you to build it, I'm going to finance the project for you to build a temple to this God that I don't even believe in. And so Zerubbabel, he gets the people back to Jerusalem. Sure enough, they start on the temple. However, some of the surrounding nations aren't that thrilled with the fact that the Israelis are going to be a superpower again. In other words, they didn't want the people of Israel back in the land of Israel. Sound a little familiar, right? So these nations, they get together, they write a letter, they send it to Cyrus, and it basically says, have you lost your mind? What in the world are you doing sending the people of Israel back to the land of Israel? Because don't you know if they get settled again, that they're going to be a pain in our backside for centuries? So the surrounding nations, they get involved. They step in. They want to stop the rebuilding of the temple, the rebuilding of the city, the rebuilding of the wall. And this goes back and forth for years. The people of Israel would build the temple, and the surrounding nations would come in and stop them. And then they would start building again, and the nations would come back. I mean, this went back and forth, and it was utter chaos. Think about this. 4 kings, 38 years later. Are you hanging with me? King Darius the Great, not to be confused with Darius the Mede, right? We talked about him before. This is King Darius the Great. He comes along. He discovers 38 years after Cyrus that Cyrus had commissioned the rebuilding of the temple. But he also discovers that the rebuilding of the temple had never been completed. So he writes a letter to the surrounding nations of Israel, and he says, not only are you to stop harassing the people of Israel, you're actually to help them finish the temple to their God that Cyrus didn't believe in, and I don't believe in either. But what's amazing to me as you read these great stories of the Old Testament is that God used these unbelieving kings to build the temple to a God that they don't even believe in to facilitate God's plan. And sure enough, according to Ezra chapter 6, verse 14, the Jews go back to work. The people quit harassing them. They finally finish the temple. Then they start working on the city. Then they start working on the wall. And we're going to look at some of these stories over the next few weeks because there's so much that applies to what's going on with us. But they reestablished the nation of Israel just as God had promised. 20 years go by. Darius the Great dies. A new king comes on the scene. His name is Artaxerxes. If you've ever read the book of Esther, you've read about Artaxerxes. And one day, for no logical reason, Artaxerxes, he gets the idea that he wants to take all this treasure, okay, all this silver, all this gold, all these temple vessels that were stolen from the Hebrew people when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the city in 586 BC. We're talking about 100 years earlier. So he wants to take all of this gold, all of this silver, and he wants to give it back to Israel. So understand, this is stuff that no Jew has seen for over 100 years. The last time they saw any Jew saw any of this is when Nebuchadnezzar was loading it up on wagons to haul it off to Babylon. But it's all been kept intact by the enemies of Israel for 100 years. So I try to picture this scene. I can see Ezra standing there with his face hanging out. And Artaxerxes says, look at all this. I want you to have it. Take it back to Jerusalem. Now, if I'm Ezra, I'm going to ask, why now? Why after 100 years do you want us to take it back? And I don't know, Artaxerxes probably said, you know what? I need a man cave. And I started looking around for the best. And I opened the doors and wow, here's all this gold and silver. I need to get rid of this junk because I'm talking about a man cave going in here, right? Cigars, everything's going to be incredible. But whatever it is, While Ezra is standing there, it dawns on him that God is alive, that God is working, that God is keeping his promise. And he realizes, sure enough, God's plan to restore Israel is coming to pass. Now, here's the problem. When Ezra and these guys start stacking all this treasure, they realize, and you can do the math, it's in Ezra chapter 8, they realize, are you ready for this? It's 24 tons of gold and silver. That's about 48,000 pounds. Okay, think of like 10 Escalades or Suburbans. Okay, they don't have trains and they don't have semis. So that's the problem. The problem is not that they get all this stuff. The problem is the temple is located 900 miles away, which in those days was a 4-month journey through the desert. And all of a sudden, Ezra's celebration is cut short because he realizes when word gets out on the streets that we're making a 4-month journey over 900 miles through the desert with 24 tons of gold and silver, we will be lucky to get back to Jerusalem with our lives, much less this loot, right? But at the same time, he's trying to keep into perspective, this is a God thing. God is obviously up to something. So here is Ezra. He's sitting on this great gift from God. He's sitting on this incredible opportunity, but yet at the same time, he's very, very fearful that he could die in the process of trying to get all of this wealth back to Jerusalem. So he initially thinks, you know what? I'll just go to King Artaxerxes. I will just ask him for an armed guard. That seems like the smart thing to do. But then he was a little embarrassed to do that because he's been talking up about how great his God is. And if his God is so great, why can't his God protect them while they're making this 4-month journey back to Jerusalem? So Ezra decides that's not a good idea. So he decides to pray and fast until God gives him a plan. And God gives him a plan. It's a pretty simple plan. It was basically this: get 24 leaders, have each one of these leaders put together a crew, and they can each carry about a ton of this stuff each, and then stagger their journeys. Start some like 2 here, wait a couple of days, send another one. That way they're not all traveling through together. It won't be so noticeable. And then Ezra gives them a prearranged day. He says, on this date, we're going to meet in front of the temple in Jerusalem, and we're going to count all the loot. We're going to weigh all the loot. We're going to see how much actually made it back. And so they start off on this journey. Ezra leads the way. And it says in 2 Chronicles 36, verse 31, the hand of God was on us, and he protected us from enemies and bandits along the way. So we arrived in Jerusalem, where we rested 3 days. Verse 33, on the 4th day, in the house of God, we weighed out the silver and the gold and the sacred articles. Everything was accounted for. And I am sure there was an unbelievable party. I am sure there was a celebration because God had intervened. God had not only restored the nation, he had restored the temple, but not only had restored the nation and the temple, he had restored the nation's wealth. It is a great story. You ought to read the Bible. It's really cool. There's some cool stuff in here. But here's the question. Why would these pagan, unbelieving kings do so much to help Israel build a temple to a God that they don't even believe in? Well, there's probably a couple of reasons. One's found in Proverbs 21, verse 1. I love this. The king's heart is like channels of water in the hands of the Lord. He turns it wherever he pleases. By the way, that doesn't just go for kings. That goes for congressmen and city councilmen and commissioners and presidents. God can do whatever he wants to do. But more importantly, it reminds us of one of the greatest truths in the Bible. And this is so important, and I think it relates to be renewed. It's Isaiah 55, verse 8. My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declared the Lord. In other words, this is what God is saying. I don't always do things the way you do things. Somehow, at times, I have a special way of how I want to do something, and you're just going to have to trust me and go with it. In other words, I think the principle of the verse is this. Every once in a while, just like with Ezra, God is going to give us opportunities to do some unusual things. Let's call them God things. But when those moments come, we then have to have the courage to take advantage of those opportunities. Now, let me just give you 3 lessons that just kind of jump right out of the story that I want to talk about this week, and they relate to be renewed as we move forward. Here's the first one. God has allowed Be Renewed to find favor with people who don't even believe what we believe. It's an amazing journey of watching what God has been doing. I don't know how long it will last. I don't even need to know how long it will last. But I'm telling you, there are a lot of people who aren't even believers who have played an incredible role behind the scenes. They've never even been here about what God has done here. When I put on Facebook that we needed a place to meet, I cannot tell you how many people came out of the woodwork and said, I'll help you find a place. In fact, I got from one guy in Cary, all he does is develop stuff. And he said, Mike, I'm not trying to make a penny off of you, but I'm going to find you a facility. And he went to looking. Someone else contacted me. Actually, we found East Cary Middle School because of someone in the Cary Chamber of Commerce, I don't even know who it is, sent me a message and said, check out East Cary. I think you can get in there. And I go there and the principal says, we don't know why it's been sitting here empty. Basically, every church school in Wake County has a church in it except this one. And this is what the principal said to me. I think God was holding it for you. How cool is that? I mean, you can't, listen, I was in a restaurant one day and a guy walked up to me and says, hey, when is it you're starting your new church at East Cary? I said, September the 8th. He says, good. I got a lot of people coming that day. I said, are you coming? He says, no, I don't believe in God, but I got a lot of people coming. How weird is that? No, I told him, you're awesome. I don't believe that stuff. But he's rounding up people to come to. In fact, the other night, how many of you were in Rigo's the other night we had dinner? We had about 40 of us out there having dinner. There was a guy sitting at the bar. You probably didn't even notice him, but I saw him. But the reason I noticed him because he's usually here at Ray's at the bar, and I talk to him all the time when I'm working here. And so I went up and just said hi to him, and he had a big smile on his face. He said, because he knows about he calls it, he says, is that the God thing you have in the back of Ray's? And I said, yeah, it's a God thing. And he said, so those people go to that thing? And I said, yeah. He said, and then he said, wow. Now this is a compliment for you guys. He said, you guys look like you love each other. He said, you guys just look like you're having a blast. He said, I was tempted to come sit with you. I said, you should have. He said, then he started asking me questions about this God thing. And I just answered his questions, no big deal. The next night I'm working at Ray's and he's at the bar in Ray's. And he went out of his way to find me and he said, I can't tell you how much that meant to me last night that you talked to me about that God thing that you're doing. And he said, I'm interested. And this is a guy. I mean, this is a big player in the world. But just the way you were acting at the restaurant and how you were communicating and loving on each other, there's a guy who doesn't even know what to call it except the God thing is interested. See, so that's my first thing. God has been behind the scenes, even getting the equipment for the new going to the school. Some of the stuff that has happened has been absolutely amazing. I mean, I get a text from a guy said, I got a trailer. You want to use it? Who are you? I don't know. Lives in Nightdale or somewhere, but he said, you guys can use it indefinitely. I mean, it's just amazing what God has done, so we didn't have to put money out. But so that's my first one. Here's the second lesson I get from the story, and this one's on me. I got to start leading this place with courage, and I haven't been. Let me show you a verse. Let me show you what, right after Ezra realizes that God has given him this incredible opportunity. Look what it says, Ezra chapter 7, verse 27. Ezra says, praise be to the Lord, the God of our ancestors, who had put it in the king's heart to bring honor to the house of the Lord in Jerusalem in this way, and who has extended his good favor to me before the king and his advisors and all the king's powerful officials. And notice this next phrase, because the hand of the Lord my God was on me, I took courage. In other words, when Ezra realized that God was at work, when he realized what was going on, this opportunity that God had given these people, he said, man, I gotta act. I gotta step up and lead regardless of the risk. Now let's be honest. Ezra could have come up with all kinds of reasons to play it safe. He could have said, my family's kind of settled here in Babylon. We've gotten used, my wife loves the shopping in Babylon. My kids, they have great schools in Babylon. He doesn't do that. In fact, he might be thinking, why in the world would I move to Israel? I hear it's nothing but a mess over there, right? But instead he said, I took courage and I stepped out. Now, I don't like saying this because I used to think of myself as a pretty good leader, but I will be honest with you. There are some areas where I have done not a great job of leading you guys, and I've been a reluctant leader. Sometimes because I think I'll be misunderstood. Sometimes I think if I lead you this way, you won't like me. And I want people to like me. It's a huge character flaw, right? Honestly, sometimes it's just because there are days that I cannot wrap my head around the fact that God is still willing to use me. That's a big one. But I'm going to tell you, this verse reminds me that God has given us some incredible opportunities here. I think he's already blessed us like crazy. But I do know this from 43 years of being a pastor. If we're going to take advantage of these opportunities, I got to pull on my big boy panties and lead the church, whether I feel like it or not. And I can't get comfortable where we are. I can't get in the car every week and say, well, you know what, it's been a good comeback story. Because I'm not even sure that we have scratched the surface of what God wants to do with this group. In fact, I felt like God saying to me over the past few weekends, probably because I had a birthday, but I felt like God's been saying, you know, Mike, this isn't the end. I want you to know that. This is just actually a new beginning for you. And he reminded me of something I always said. There is no retirement in the Bible, right? God's like, we're going to see whether you believe it or not now, because you're not retiring, right? In fact, he reminded me, Moses didn't really start his second career till 80, right? And so I got a few years on Moses. But here's the thing. I felt like God's been saying, this is not the time to coast. You got to lead with diligence. You got to lead with courage, which brings me to the third lesson. I'm reading this story, and this is only a pastor would get this out of the story, okay? Here's 25 tons of gold and silver sitting in what's going to be Artaxerxes' man cave, right? And I'm thinking, well, God, why couldn't you just do something like that for us? Why couldn't you just dump a few million on us? You know, maybe Town Bank, that's where we do our banking. Town Bank calls and say, hey, you know what? We just did an audit. We got $19 million in the vault. We don't, but you guys have been such good customers. If you'll bring all your SUVs and minivans over here, you can load it up and have it, right? And we would have all the money we would ever do to do whatever God wanted us to do in the world as it relates to his kingdom. And then it hit me, and here's the lesson. God has already provided us with all we need to take advantage of the opportunity he's given us. We already have it. I mean, you won't believe this, and you'll see everybody when you get together. We have about 250 people adults who now see Be Renewed as their church home. Now, again, we don't all get together because we only come to church 3 out of 8 weekends. But hey, if we all got together on Easter, we'd all be here, or Christmas, you know. But there's about 250 of us. Now, this is what I know. God has distributed all the wealth we need among us. Some of us have more than others. Some of us have less than others, but it's been distributed among us. But my point is, it's already here. It's in our bank accounts. I just have been kind of reluctant to try to encourage you to get it out of your bank account and invest in what God is doing here. Now, I'll just tell you, be upfront, as we move, these are some things you need to know. It's going to cost us some money. Typically, when a church goes into a school to start a campus, it costs anywhere between $150,000 to $200,000, if you can imagine. We're going to do it for about $10,000 to $12,000. We've been given so much stuff, but there's some stuff we have to buy. You got to have a screen. You got to have a projector. You got to have some kind of sound system. And the guy that's done my sound system used to be my tech director at Hope. And man, he just gave us a steal on this thing. We thought we were going to get it free, but we're still getting it for about 30 to 40% of what we would have to spend. We've been given free trailers and all kinds of stuff to keep it in. God has been incredible, but it's going to do that. It's going to cost us about $2,200 a month to use the school. We have to have a policeman every week. That's going to cost us a few $100s a month. But have you noticed, I hadn't even pushed for like, hey, could we expend our giving to do that? Because I just didn't want to. I have actually, and Shannon will tell you this, I've actually had a lot of lunches with people who don't even go to Be Renewed because it's easier to be rejected by them than it is to be rejected by you. And I'd say, you want to give me a little bit of money to help with this thing? Nope. Okay, I can deal with that. But if you tell me no, it hurts my feelings. So now here's the funny thing. I will wear you guys out about most things. I will get on something and I will teach it over and over again until you finally like surrender and say, okay, I'll do it. You know, I'll read my Bible, you know, I'll serve, I'll forgive that guy. I don't want to forgive. I'll do it. I just will wear you out, right? But when it comes to handling that with money, I don't like to do it. Never have liked to do it. And part of it's because I know you bring your friends here and they hate preachers who talk about money. I'm sensitive to that, right? But I'll tell you the other part of the reason. You do a pretty good job without me having to say anything. So maybe we could just coast, right? But think about it this way. And then some of you are like, well, wait, I know what some of you are thinking because this is what you might, well, do we really need it? Well, that's not why you give. In fact, if I'm a good leader, you'll never know whether we need it or not. Because I don't want my friend to come from the gym and think, oh, they just need money. So you're never going to know whether we need it or not. So think about it this way. God has given us and is going to continue to give us, and he does this with every church, incredible opportunities to change the world. And we will either give the way God has asked us to give generously so that we can respond to those needs or we won't. And so as the leader, at least for right now, I have a choice to make. I can lead in every other area, like your time and your talent, except this one, or I can lead in all areas and I can challenge you about your time, your talent, and your treasure. So I got to lead you in this area by telling you, you know what, we're doing a good job. We're doing actually a good job. We have money in the bank. We're doing a good job, but we're not doing what we could do, and we're not doing what we should do. And if we don't, we'll miss the opportunity. God's going to give us a lot of opportunities, and we'll either take advantage of the opportunities because we planned ahead and we were good stewards and good managers, or we won't. Now, just so you know, the temptation for me is to do nothing. I was actually laying in bed the other day. It's a hassle moving from Ray's, which is free, no stress. I even have a key to the restaurant if I need it, right? To a school. The work that goes on behind the scenes, the applications that have to be done, insurance and waivers and liability policies and all of those things. I hate all that kind of stuff. I could very easily coast. I think we could probably be happy just showing up, opening the door to Ray, having a little Bible study and going our way and not make any difference in the world whatsoever. But I will tell you this, I'm not wired that way. I don't think you're wired that way either. I mean, if we're going to do this, I think at the end of the day, we want to make a difference. And I want to clarify something. I have zero desire to become a big fancy church. I have pastored Six Flags Over Jesus Community Church. Okay, I've been there. I know what that's like, and God, it's a good ride. And you know what? I know what that's like. But I also know what it's like then to sit in board meetings and realize that you got to where you were by faith, but now you got to talk about risk management so you don't lose. I'm not interested in any of that, and I think God has blessed churches and mega churches. I think they're phenomenal. I've been down that road. That is not where I want to go again. It's about us being a spiritual hospital. That's what I'm interested in. This is about us being a rehab unit for our broken community and world. And just by moving us to East Cary, God has already strategically positioned us to do this. We're getting ready to provide on August 22nd. You don't even know it, but we're catering a lunch to the whole staff at East Cary Middle School. I cannot tell you the emails we're getting, just how appreciative they are already that we would care enough about them to do that. Somebody in our group has said, we'd like to do bags for all the teachers. So we're communicating with the staff over there. What can we give all these teachers? Kind of a little swag bag that would encourage them. But that's what God has already given us this opportunities, but it will require us to meet them to make a commitment to the principles of generosity that God's laid out in the Bible. So what did he lay out in the Bible? Very simple for those of you who went to Durham County schools like I did and you don't know math very well. God made it very simple. Every time you get $10, you give them one. See how simple that is? Brian, where'd you go to school? Durham, see? Can you do that? How many? If you got 10, how many you give, Brian? One. Okay, that's that simple. You got 1,000, you just knock off a zero. You got 5,000, you just knock off a zero. It's very, very simple. Just knock off a zero. And if everyone, here's the cool thing. It's God's anyway. He's just letting you manage it for him. So God says, listen, if you'll just give me one back, you can keep the other 9 that's also mine and do whatever you want. I mean, it's the greatest deal in the world when you think. Can you imagine if the government today said, we're only going to take 10% of your taxes? Man, we would be doing backflips, wouldn't we? Right? So anyway, it's a great deal. Now, can you imagine the impact we could have if we just planned ahead and we were prepared to do this way? The Central African Republic, the average household income, $240 a year, poorest country on the planet. Those people never had a drop of clean drinking water in their life till that well was drilled. But here's what's cool. Jim is now bringing in a trained African pastor from that area. And I have done this before. I've been there. Jim has showed me the villages. I remember going to one of the darkest, you could feel the spiritual oppression there. And I said, yeah, we'll drill a well here. And they brought that pastor in. I went the next year, and we sat around the fire. And their village of about 300 people are singing their worship songs in Sango to me. And it hit me. This is what Jesus was talking about. He said, the field's white unto harvest. See, when those people who have absolutely nothing, whose lifespan is 39 for a man and 42 for a woman, and all of a sudden they hear the gospel and the good news of Jesus Christ and hope for a future. They don't have any hope in this life, but they're all about a hope for a future. It changes their lives. It literally changes their life. We could do 2 or 3 of those villages a year without even breaking a sweat, if we gave a sweat. But not just that. Backpacks. I've already talked to the principal. What we want going into next year, we want a list of every child in East Cary Middle School who can't afford a backpack and the supplies that go into it. We're going to take care of that. We want a list of the teachers so we can make sure that, did you know most teachers have to supply their classroom out of their pocket? I mean, we found out last week there was a teacher that had been here a couple of times. Somebody told us that just in passing that she's such a wonderful person. She's actually supplying the needs out of her pocket. She can't afford it. So Shannon gave her several gift cards, big gift cards to Walmart so she could go and just take care of this so she wouldn't have this on herself. We want to be there for those teachers. Let me tell you something else we can do, counseling. We need a big pot of money that just sits over here so that when people come to us with issues, have you guys noticed our culture is complicated? I'm telling you, I have been in counseling when my first thought was, they didn't teach us this in seminary. In fact, I actually had a woman in my office one night. She came in the evening and she shared with me how she was a boy, but then her parents helped her change to a man. No, she was a man, changed to a woman, then accepted Christ. And she went on to something saying that she'd accepted Christ. And somebody responded, a great Christian, well, you're going to go to hell no matter what you do. And so she was in my office. This is what she wanted to know. Can I be a Christian? I said, yeah, you can be a Christian. And then she said, can I be a part of this church? And I said, absolutely, you can be a part of this church. But she asked me a question. She said, I don't know. They didn't teach me that in seminary. I mean, I don't know what happens when your mom and dad helped you transition at 18 and now you're 40. And I didn't even know. She had been at the church for a few months. I didn't even know that. But I'm just saying, we're not equipped many times. But see, this is where we need to help people. I had someone that wanted to go to breakfast with me, and he said he'd had an affair. And we kind of talked through all of that. And I'm like, man, listen, I'm telling you, I've learned the hard way. Let me tell you what the right advice is here, right? But then at the end, he said, there's one wrinkle. I had the affair with a man. And I'm like, oh. Okay, let's back up. Forget everything I said. Let's back up. You know, but here's a guy there's deeper issues there. So sometimes people need strong biblical counseling from a professional. But when we have the resources, what I can do is go to these counselors in the community that are good Christian, biblically based counsel, and I can negotiate cheaper rates. And then I can say, if they will pay $20, can we cover the other $50 or $60 or whatever we land on? And this will actually help us be that rehab unit that we've talked about. We can do those kinds of things. Some of you keep asking me, is Benji going to join us? Well, guess what? You're going to decide because it's going to take money. I mean, a minister, a laborer is worthy of his hire. You don't think he's just going to come work for free, right? I mean, so these are the kind of things that we have to think about. So here's my challenge. Let's just rise to the commitment that God has called us to. And by the way, you get Benji and me together, I tell you, it will be the equivalent of 20 staff. We've got 70 years of ministry between us. We can get some things done. But again, it's going to take generosity, and we're building up that nest egg, so that maybe is a possibility. We'll talk more about it maybe later on this year. But I believe that if we do this, and we show God that we're trustworthy, you know what he'll keep doing? Giving us more opportunities. Giving us more opportunities. And so I talked to one of my board guys this week, and I said, I hadn't even asked. And he said, well, we should do something. So I asked around, and I found somebody. He said, okay, this is what I'll do. He said, on August 25th, everything we give above our regular giving toward paying for the equipment stuff that we're going, he said, I'll match right now. I'll say I'll match up to $5,000. If we get $5,000 that day, I'll give you another $5,000. If it comes in over that, maybe we'll do that too. So on August 25th, if you would like to donate anything over your regular giving to the equipment and maybe helping us with a surplus of paying the rent and the lease on the school, it will be matched up to $5,000. So that's a good kingdom investment right there. And we're going to see what God is doing. But let me just tell you, we're never more like imitators of God than when we're generous. What did God say? For God so loved the world, he gave his most priceless possession. So I'm not asking for anybody to do everything. I'm saying if we all just did our part, we would be positioned to anything God brought our way. And I tell you what, as we're faithful, he'll continue to bring those opportunities to us. And you will look back, I'm just telling you, you will look back one day and say, that may have been the most exciting thing I've ever been a part of in my life. As you rub shoulders and hear stories every week whose people's lives were in chaos. But through your generosity and through your friendship and through your kind word, their life was changed. And that's what we want to be. Father, thank you for the chance to be here today. And I hate talking about this topic, but God, you don't. You say more about giving than any other topic in the Bible. And I think you talk so much about it because you knew it's where we would struggle the most. And so you just work in our hearts. You work in our hearts. You know what you want us to do. You know what you want us to accomplish. And I am 100% that if you order it, you know how to pay for it. But many times you want to pay for it through us. And you give us the resources. And if we do what you've called us to do, these things will happen. So I thank you for this group of people. And Father, next week, as we talk about how just the teaching of the Word of God has to remain so central to who we are and how that can never change and never waver. Help us to begin to prepare our hearts now. Once again, we see this from the life of Ezra. And I'm excited what you're doing and what you're going to do. In your name we pray. Amen.